All right, guys. Hey, guys. Today we're going to start with our first attempt at a flipped classroom and see how this works. Today we're going to be talking about how did Europe control Latin America. So you should write that down. And the reason why we're talking today about how did Europe control Latin America is we have to see how the Spanish, mostly the Spanish, controlled the area, so we can understand why the people of South America and the Caribbean and Mexico decided to break away from Spanish rule. Just like we had been talking about the conditions of French government leading up to the French Revolution. So the first question we're going to talk about, and I want you to write this question down: how did the Spanish benefit economically from their colonies? Now, of course, the reason why any country wants to have a colony is in order to make money. So how were the Spanish actually making money from their colonies? So if we look at this map here, this is of the European empires in the 1660s. So for the Spanish, in the 1660s, it was essentially broken up into two what were called viceroyalties: New Spain and Peru. Notice also that they're pretty much hugging the areas along the coast. And then also you can see that the Portuguese have this area here, Brazil. And then there's, you could see the English and the Dutch and the French have land here. So there's other people controlling random areas. But basically we're talking about the Portuguese and the Spanish. So in the 1500s, the major way the Spanish were making money off their colonies was through silver mining. So here we can see, this is a picture of the Potosi mine, and this was in Peru. And this was one of the largest silver lodes. I don't know why my pen isn't working that well. This is one of the largest silver lodes ever found in the world. There was about 160,000 people who lived high up in the Andes Mountains for the sole purpose of mining silver for the Spanish. The other major center of silver production was called the Zacatecas mine. And that was in Mexico. So you have the Potosi mine in Peru, and you have the Zacatecas mine in Mexico. And both of these areas became very wealthy mining centers, where there was lots of luxuries for some, but as far as the Native Americans, it was a lot of hard work and exploitation. So the Viceroy of Peru said it was not the silver, it was not silver that was sent to Spain, but the blood and sweat of the Indians. And so if you think back to the silver trade DBQ and think about that document from the Spanish priest, and he was kind of speaking out on behalf of the plight of the Native Americans, that's why, because the Native Americans were really horribly overworked in this system. And there was a couple of ways that this was done. If you remember from Miss Canone's class last year, I'm going to erase these two things here. When the areas were first settled, conquistadors were given something called, which was a system called the encomienda system. In the encomienda system, the conquistador got a plot of land, and he was allowed to exploit the people that lived there and demand labor and taxes for them, and in return he was expected to Christianize them. And this really was a system of essentially slavery for the Native Americans. That system eventually pretty much dies out and is replaced by other systems. The reason why it dies out is the plots of land that were given to what was called the encomiendero, they were short-term leases on the land. They were allowed maybe 10 years to work the land, exploit the workers as much as they wanted, because the Spanish did not want to create a new aristocracy of kind of some of the people that were seen as a little bit low-life-esque that had come to the colonies to kind of make their money off the New World. The other, basically what we see is that system of the encomienda system is replaced by something called the mita. And that's an I right there. Now the mita system is actually something where the Spanish kind of built upon an Incan system. The mita system was a labor tax, so every Incan was expected to do free labor during certain times of the year. But the Incan people got a lot of benefits from the Incan government. They got food, they got public works. If there was any sort of famine, they'd provided for, and they wouldn't have to worry about starvation. And so there was there was a reciprocal relationship. The people gave free labor, the government gave back a lot of stuff to them. What the Spanish did is they took that whole concept of the free labor, they got rid of the whole concept of giving back to the people, but they referred to it as the mita because that it was something that the Incans were used to doing. So in 1572, there was a mining mita which sent about 13,000 workers per year to Potosi to do free labor in the mines, forced free labor. And the Spanish government got 1/5 of all of the production. And if we look at this picture here, we can see, now this is a native porter. A porter is someone who kind of carries a heavy load. And we can see here how the Native Americans were treated by the Spanish, because this Spanish man here is essentially kicking him in the chest, treating him almost like an animal. Meanwhile, there's an animal there that could have carried this heavy load. This kind of shows you how the Spanish thought of their workers. If we look at this picture here, we see the Spanish are dressed and seated in this very bright, expensive clothing, and here all of the workers are doing this work and basically naked, with no shoes on, working down into the mines. Now, the mining was the heart of the colonial economy. The mines in New Spain produced about a half of all of the precious metals in the world. But in the end, this did very little to help the people of the Americas themselves. But mining did impact other areas of the economy because these workers had to be fed, the mines had to be supplied. In Mexico, the mines were very far away. The Zacatecas mine was not close to where anybody had lived prior to the Spanish coming there, so a whole new system had to be set up to provide for the people. In Peru, the mines were high up in the Andes Mountains, so the food and supplies had to be brought up from far away to bring up to supply the people in the mines. And so if we look at this picture here, we also can see the ways in which the people were treated. You could see this man here has a whip in his hand to beat all these people who are half dressed. Meanwhile, the friar is there to Christianize them. They're being forced to do heavy work, and if they disobey, the punishment is to be killed, which kind of shows a little bit about how the Spanish were treating the people in their colonies. We also start to see agriculture as becoming a more permanent way of making money for the Spanish, because the mines are only going to last for so long, and eventually they're going to run out of silver, and they're not going to be able to continue to be producing them. So we do see an agrarian economy develop that's really building upon the indigenous communal agriculture that had already been there. So a lot of the traditional crops that have been grown in the Incan and Aztec times are going to be continuing to be grown. However, we all know because of smallpox and mistreatment, a lot of the Native American populations are going to fall and are going to be replaced by Spanish farmers, and they're going to create these large ranches and farms that are called, sorry, I forgot to turn my pen on, that are called haciendas. And the haciendas are these large farms that are producing for consumption in America. So basically, the Americas themselves were self-sufficient. The only things that they were importing from Spain was luxury items. In Ecuador, in New Spain, in Peru, there was a lot of sheep raising. There were textile sweatshops. Most of the cloth was being produced by women. And again, most of the stuff was produced for themselves, for their own consumption, and they only needed to import luxuries. But the haciendas became the basis of wealth and power for this new Spanish aristocracy that is going to begin to develop in the area. Now, the Spanish, given the fact that they were, very far away from their colonies, they wanted to make sure that they were able to make all of the money possible off of their colonies. So the Spanish collected taxes, and that was referred to as the royal fifth. So a fifth or 20% of all of the goods that were coming out of the colonies had to go directly to Spain. And the way that the Spanish did this is they created a bureaucratic system that allowed them to really oversee what they were getting from their colonies. So all trade from the colonies had to go into the port of Seville in Spain, or, which is not on this map, or the port of Cadiz. And this was all done in something called a convoy system. And all of this was overseen by the Board of Trade in Seville. So what would happen is there would be 2 convoys sent across the Atlantic Ocean annually And what you see is all the silver that's coming out of the Potosi mine is being kind of gathered together in Lima, and then being shipped to Cartagena, which is in Colombia, which was a heavily fortified area, because they're holding on to all this silver. 2 fleets a year would go to China, or actually to Manila, which was the Spanish colony in the Philippines. So it would go to Manila. They would exchange their silver, like again in that DBT you guys did. They would exchange their silver for all of the Chinese luxuries and goods. They would come back here. They would meet up here in Acapulco. They would have to take all of the goods, walk it across the Isthmus of Panama to here. They would all meet in Havana. And then as a large group of galleon ships, a large convoy, they would go across the Atlantic to Seville, where before the ships would even be let into port, the Board of Trade would board the ships, register everything, inventory everything, take the royal fifth or the 20% for the Spanish crown, and then that money, then all of those goods would be allowed to get into Spain. And the reason why they did this is they wanted to be able to, number one, keep track of all of the goods that were coming in and out of the colonies, and number two, by sailing in these large fleets, they were able to prevent any sort of pirate activity, and they actually only lost 1 fleet to the Dutch in 1627. So if we look at this picture here, this is what one of these Spanish galleons, what are these ships would look like. And if we see here, this is a cross-section of one of these ships, and you could see all of the goods that would be piled into these ships trading across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, you would think that Spain would be this incredibly wealthy country with all of this money going in and out of Spain, and in actuality, they really weren't. Most of the silver that went into Spain flowed right back out of Spain to pay for wars, to cover their debts, and to purchase manufactured goods, because the Spanish really actually didn't produce anything themselves. Less than half of the silver stayed in Spain. And what this actually did is this led to huge amounts of inflation in Spain, as well as huge amounts of inflation in Western Europe. No more than a quarter of the Spanish revenue was from this trade coming in from the colonies. Most of the money the Spanish brought in to spend for their annual debts or spending was done by taxes on their own population. What the supply of the silver did allow them to do is to get credit from the banks, because everyone knows that Spain is getting all this money constantly. So they figured, oh, they must have tons of money. So banks would give them credit. And what that did in the end was bankrupt the government and actually destroyed many of the larger banking houses in Europe, who were the ones who had given the money to Spain. In 1619, a man by the name of Sancho de Macada said that the poverty of the Spanish resulted from the discovery of the Indies. So actually, in the end, you would think Spain would be this massive powerhouse, economic powerhouse with all this money, since they're literally having boatloads of silver coming across. But in the end, they were really badly affected economically by the control of their colonies, partly because the Spanish really did not produce anything themselves of their own worth in their country. If they were like England, which was manufacturing goods themselves, they could have probably turned this around and made a lot of money for themselves, but in the end, the money just kind of stopped in Spain for a little bit and flowed right back out of Spain. So I'm going to stop here for our first little lecture here, and we're going to pick up on another day, and I'm going to start talking about how did the European powers actually control their colonies.